In a world where power and wealth seem to solve everything, a young billionaire at just 20 years old, isolated by grief and betrayal, discovers that his fortune is also his prison. On a random street corner, an encounter with a single mother, fighting to protect her son from a cruel eviction, turns his life upside down. What begins as an impulsive act of kindness unravels a web of corruption and buried tragedies, forcing him to confront devastating truths about his family, his company, and above all, himself. In the crossfire of dark interests and personal battles, two strangers become unlikely allies, ready to challenge everything and everyone in pursuit of justice and redemption. Ethan Thompson gazed at the city of New York through the massive windows of his office on the top floor of the Thompson Tech headquarters. At 20, he carried not only the weight of a tech empire valued at billions, but also the memories of a childhood abruptly cut short just 2 years ago when his parents left on a business trip from which they never returned. The young executive adjusted his expensive tie, a mechanical gesture he repeated whenever he felt anxious. On the glass table in front of him, a stack of documents awaited his signature, decisions that would affect thousands of lives, but which he couldn't focus on analyzing. His reflection in the glass revealed deep dark circles, witnesses to sleepless nights. "Ethan?" The voice of his uncle, Richard Thompson, echoed through the room after a soft knock on the door. "The board is waiting." "I'll be right there," he replied automatically without turning around. Richard approached, his steps silent on the Italian carpet. "Nephew, I know it's hard, but you need to get more involved in the company's decisions. Your father—" "Don't finish that sentence," Ethan cut him off, finally turning around. "Don't use my father to manipulate me, Uncle." Richard raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture, his impeccable suit and carefully combed gray hair, completing the image of the seasoned executive who had taken control of the company after the tragedy. "I'm just worried about you, Ethan, and about your family's legacy." Ethan sighed, running his hands through his dark hair. He knew his uncle was right about one thing. He was neglecting his responsibilities. But how could he focus on spreadsheets and reports when he felt like his life had completely lost its meaning? "I'll be at the meeting in 5 minutes, he promised, turning back to the window. Richard hesitated for a moment as if he wanted to say more, but ultimately withdrew in silence. As soon as the door closed, Ethan loosened his tie, feeling suffocated, not just by the accessory, but by the entire life that seemed to no longer belong to him. On his desk, the photo frame of his parents seemed to stare at him with disapproval. Albert and Marina Thompson had built Thompson Tech from the ground up, turning a small software development startup into one of the largest tech companies in Latin America. They were visionaries, but they had never lost their humanity, something Ethan felt was slipping away in the cold corridors of that building. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson." Emily, his assistant, peeked her head through the door. "Mr. Richard asked me to remind you about the expansion project presentation today." Ethan nodded mechanically. Another meeting where he would have to feign interest in charts and projections while his uncle orchestrated everything with the efficiency of a conductor. Sometimes he wondered if his presence there even made a difference. "Emily, cancel my afternoon appointments," he suddenly decided. "But sir," the meeting with the investors. "Tell them I had an emergency, anything." Ethan grabbed his blazer. "And please don't track me today." Before his assistant could protest, he was already in the private elevator. He needed to escape, to breathe fresh air, to feel normal, even if just for a few hours. He swapped his tailored blazer for a more casual jacket he kept in his car and drove aimlessly through the streets of New York. After a few hours of wandering the city, he parked on a busy street in Brooklyn. There, blending into the crowd, he felt like just another young man. No one recognized him as the billionaire heir to Thompson Tech. No one expected him to make decisions that would shake the financial market. That's when he saw her for the first time. A young woman was arguing with 2 men in suits at the door of an old townhouse. In her arms, a child of about 4 clung to her, frightened. Ethan couldn't help but approach, catching fragments of the heated argument. "Please, I just need—" "More time," the woman pleaded, her voice trembling but firm. "My son is sick. I just paid for his medicine." "Mrs. Carter, the eviction notice is clear," one of the men replied with practiced coldness. The property has been sold, and the new management will not accept any further extensions. Ethan felt something stir within him, a sense of urgency he hadn't experienced in a long time. This scene represented everything his parents had always fought against, corporate indifference overriding humanity. Before he realized it, his feet were already carrying him toward the confrontation, ready to intervene. "Excuse me," Ethan approached the group, maintaining a calm but firm demeanor. "What's the amount of the debt?" The woman looked at him, in surprise, while the officers exchanged suspicious glances. The boy in her arms stopped crying, curious about the presence of the well-dressed stranger. "Sorry, but this is a private matter," one of the men replied, adjusting his tie uncomfortably. "Mommy, who is he?" whispered the boy, hiding his face in his mother's neck. "I don't know, sweetheart," she replied, studying Ethan with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. There was something familiar about the young man, but she couldn't quite place it. "Ma'am," Ethan hesitated. "Helen Carter," she finished, still cautious. "Mrs. Carter, please let me help," Ethan insisted, pulling out his phone. "I can resolve this right now." Helen adjusted her son in her arms, her pride battling the desperation of the situation. "Look, I appreciate it, but I can't accept money. From strangers, it wouldn't be right." "It's not charity," Ethan argued, his voice soft but determined. "Consider it a loan if you prefer, but don't let your son go through this." Helen's eyes filled with restrained tears. Lucas, her son, absent-mindedly played with the necklace she always wore, a simple chain with a star-shaped pendant, the only inheritance from her mother. The mention of the boy's well-being struck her most vulnerable point. The total amount, including interest and penalties, is $78,000, the officer informed, consulting his clipboard. Ethan didn't hesitate. With a few taps on his phone, he made the transfer right then and there. The officers checked the receipt and, after a few calls, confirmed the payment. "You're lucky to have friends like this," one of them commented, putting away the documents. "We'll close the eviction process." When the men walked away, Helen finally let her tears flow. I don't know how to thank you. I don't even know how I'll be able to pay you back." "Don't worry about that now," Ethan smiled, feeling for the first time in a long while that he was doing something truly meaningful. "Can I at least offer you a coffee? You look like you need to talk." Helen hesitated, but something in the young man's sincere gaze made her accept. There was a familiar sadness in his eyes, something she recognized from her own daily struggles. At the small bakery on the corner, Lucas distracted himself with a chocolate bread while Helen shared her story. A graphic design graduate, she worked as a freelancer to support her son after the boy's father abandoned them. Lucas's recent illness, a severe case of pneumonia, had drained all her savings on medication and doctor visits. "You know what's the most ironic part?" she commented, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. "I had 3 big clients, projects that would pay well. But they all cancelled at the same time when they were bought out by a larger company, Thompson Tech." Ethan felt his stomach drop. That name, his name, had never sounded so heavy. "The new administration cancelled all contracts with smaller suppliers," Helen continued, unaware of her companion's discomfort. "They say it's company policy to work only with large, certified agencies. In a month, I lost practically all my income." "And Lucas's father?" Ethan asked, trying to steer the conversation away from his company. "He disappeared when he found out I was pregnant." Helen shrugged, a sad smile on her lips. "Sometimes I think it was for the best. Lucas never missed." "What he never knew?" Ethan watched the boy, who was now focused on drawing on a napkin. There was something special about that child, a sweetness that contrasted with all the harshness of the corporate world he knew. "And you?" Helen suddenly asked. "Why did you decide to help a stranger?" It was Ethan's turn to hesitate. How could he explain that this gesture represented everything he wanted to be, everything his parents had taught him before they passed away? "Let's just say I understand what it's like to lose everything in an instant," he replied vaguely. "And maybe I need help just as much as you do, just a different kind." Helen furrowed her brow, intrigued. There was much more to this young man than his polished appearance suggested. Before she could ask more, her phone buzzed with a work message. "I need to go," she said, standing up and picking up Lucas. I have a meeting with a potential client in half an hour, but how can I reach you to start repaying the loan? Ethan wrote his personal number on a napkin. Call me when you can. And don't worry about deadlines, okay? He watched Helen walk away carrying Lucas, who waved happily. Something inside him had changed that afternoon. For the first time since losing his parents, he felt that maybe there was a greater purpose for his fortune than just adding more zeros to a bank account. His phone rang insistently, several messages from his assistant and his uncle about the missed meetings. But Ethan didn't care anymore. He had made a decision. He needed to understand exactly what was happening with his family's company, and why so many people were being hurt by decisions he didn't even know existed. Helen spent the night awake, researching possible jobs. Lucas slept peacefully in the next room, his breathing still slightly affected by his recent pneumonia. The small notebook on her lap illuminated her focused face as she browsed through portfolios of potential clients. It was during this search that an ad caught her attention. Thomson Tech announces new supplier policy. The article showed a photo of the young CEO of the company at a press conference. Helen felt the air leave her lungs. It was him, her mysterious benefactor from the day before. Ethan Thompson, she murmured, reading the photo caption. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The immediate transfer of a considerable sum, the expensive clothes, the polite but distant demeanor. How had she not recognized one of the most photographed faces in the country? Her first reaction was disbelief, followed by a wave of anger. The man who had helped her was the same one running the company responsible for her current financial situation. She was overcome with a feeling of humiliation. Had he known all along? Had it all been some kind of charity act to ease his conscience? The phone beside her showed Miguel's unanswered message from the night before. I hope you and Lucas are doing well. Can we meet tomorrow? With hands trembling with indignation, Helen typed a reply. I don't need your charity, Mr. Thompson. You can keep your money and your clean conscience. She blocked the number immediately, tears of frustration streaming down her face. How naive had she been to believe that someone would help without ulterior motives. The next morning, while dropping Lucas off at daycare, she found an envelope at the entrance of her building. Inside, along with the transfer receipt, was a handwritten letter. Helen, I imagine by now you know who I am. But I need you to understand. Yesterday was the first time in a long time that I felt truly useful. It wasn't charity, it was an attempt to do what's right. Please give me the chance to explain in person. Ethan. Mommy, why are you crying? Lucas asked, tugging at her shirt. It's nothing, sweetheart. She forced a smile, tucking the letter into her bag. Just something in my eye. At the Thomson Tech office, Ethan couldn't focus. He had spent the night reviewing contracts and uncovering a series of changes implemented over the past few months, all signed by his uncle with his supposed authorization. Ethan, we need to discuss your absence yesterday. Richard entered his office without knocking. The investors were concerned. Interesting that you mention concern, Uncle. Ethan turned his laptop, showing a spreadsheet. How about we discuss these mass contract cancellations with small suppliers? When exactly did I authorize that? Richard adjusted his tie, a habit Ethan was starting to associate with nervousness. These are strategic decisions, nephew. We need to optimize processes, reduce risks. By destroying family businesses in the process. Ethan stood up, his voice filled with indignation. This is not what my parents built. Your parents are no longer here, Richard replied curtly. And with all due respect, you barely show up to important commitments. How do you expect to understand the complexities of the market? Before Ethan could respond, his assistant rushed in. Mr. Thompson, there's a woman at reception insisting on seeing you. She's quite upset. Ethan felt his heart race. Helen. Ignoring his uncle's protests, he headed to the elevator. He found her in the lobby, holding Lucas by the hand and facing two security guards who were trying to stop her from going up. It's okay, he signaled to the guards. She can come up. Helen looked at him with a mix of hurt and defiance. I didn't come to ask for more favors, Mr. Thompson. I came to return your money. She handed him an envelope. I got a loan from the bank. I don't want to owe anything to someone who destroys small businesses to increase their profits. Helen, please let me explain. Ethan took a step toward her, but she stepped back. Explain what? How your company cancels contracts without notice? How people like me are discarded for not being big enough? Her voice trembled. Do you know how many sleepless nights I spent trying to figure out where I went wrong? And now, I find out I was just another spreadsheet on your desk, another number to be cut. Lucas looked from one to the other, confused by the tension in the air. Mom, is that the chocolate bread guy? The innocent question momentarily broke the tension. Helen held her son's hand tighter. Yes, sweetheart, but we're leaving now. Please, Ethan pleaded, 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Helen hesitated, looking at her son. She didn't want Lucas to witness that argument, but she also needed answers. That's when Richard appeared in the lobby. Ethan, the shareholders are waiting, Richard announced, his voice carefully controlled as he approached. His eyes assessed Helen and Lucas with an interest that made Ethan instinctively step between them. Mrs. Carter, isn't it? Richard smiled, ignoring his nephew's attempt to block him. What an interesting coincidence. I just received a report about your case. Helen raised her chin, holding the executive's gaze. I didn't know small freelancers deserved so much attention from the board. Oh, but you've caught our attention. Richard pulled a tablet from his jacket, swiping, his finger across the screen. Especially after we discovered some irregularities in the projects you developed for our former partners. Ethan noticed the sudden shift in Helen's demeanor, a nearly imperceptible tremor in her hands. Lucas, sensing his mother's tension, clung tighter to her leg. What irregularities? She asked, her voice betraying a slight quiver. Uncle, that's enough, Ethan intervened, but Richard raised his hand, demanding silence. Misuse of intellectual property, unauthorized code in your designs, Richard continued, his voice now laced with false concern. You know how serious this is in our field, don't you? Helen paled. That's a lie. All my projects are original. I can prove it. Mom? Lucas called, frightened by the change in his mother's tone. Ethan watched the scene with growing indignation. He knew that tone of his uncle's all too well, the same one he used in meetings to discredit competitors or inconvenient employees. Helen? He gently touched her arm. Let's talk in my office, please. After a moment of hesitation, she nodded. Richard watched the three of them head toward the elevator with a restrained smile on his lips. In the spacious presidential office, Lucas was soon distracted by a small decorative robot on the shelf, a prototype of Ethan's parents' first successful project. They were different, Ethan remarked, noticing the boy's interest in the robot. My parents, they built this company believing that technology should bring people together, not destroy them. Helen sat down, exhausted. Why is your uncle doing this? Why now? Because he's losing control, Ethan replied, sitting across from her. And people like him become dangerous when they feel they're losing power. He opened his laptop, showing Helen a series of documents. I spent the night investigating. All the cancelled contracts, including yours, were part of a restructuring that I supposedly approved. But my signature on these documents, it's not mine. Helen examined the files, her designer eyes noticing subtle inconsistencies. These signatures, they're scanned, but they have small variations. Someone manipulated the files. Exactly, Ethan confirmed. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are dozens of decisions over the past few months that I never authorized. My uncle has been using my grief, my absence, to take full control. That's why he got nervous when he saw me here, Helen concluded. I'm living proof of the company's unethical practices, and now he's trying to discredit you before you become a real threat, Ethan added. The plagiarism accusations are false, I'm sure, but he'll use the full legal power of the company to make them seem true. Helen covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed. I can't go through this. Lucas, he's already suffered so much from my absence while I was working. I can't risk losing custody of him over false accusations. Ethan looked at the boy, who had now fallen asleep on the office couch, exhausted from the hectic morning. I won't let that happen. But I need your help. My help? Helen looked at him, surprised. You have an eye for detail. You noticed the inconsistencies in the signatures right away, Ethan explained. And you know other suppliers who have been harmed. Together, we can expose what my uncle is doing." "It's very risky," Helen hesitated. "He seems to have influential people on his side." "Yes, he does," Ethan admitted. "But I also have my allies. Emily, my assistant, has been keeping copies of all the original documents. And there's more. I found records of suspicious meetings between my uncle and the broker who was pushing for your eviction." Helen frowned. "The same broker who tripled my rent overnight?" "Exactly," Ethan confirmed. "None of this is a coincidence. Helen, my uncle is systematically eliminating small businesses in strategic areas of the city. The question is, why?" Before Helen could respond, the office door opened. Emily rushed in, her face pale. "Ethan, you need to see this. The board, they're calling an emergency meeting. Your uncle is proposing your removal as chairman." Ethan and Helen exchanged worried glances. The war was just beginning, and they would need each other to survive what was coming. The following week was a roller coaster of emotions and discoveries. Ethan and Helen set up an improvised operations base in her apartment, far from the eyes and ears of Thompson Tech. Emily, Ethan's assistant, became their connection to the corporate world, bringing vital documents and information whenever possible. "Look at this," Helen pointed to her laptop, where she was analyzing a series of emails leaked by Emily. Lucas played quietly on the living room carpet with his stuffed dinosaurs, occasionally looking up to observe the focused adults. "All the properties bought after the evictions follow a pattern." Miguel leaned over her shoulder, his subtle cologne momentarily distracting Helen. "What pattern?" "They're all near planned subway stations," she explained, struggling to maintain focus. "And look at the dates. The purchases started exactly 2 weeks after your uncle's secret meeting with the transportation secretary." "Insider information," Miguel murmured, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "He's using confidential government data for real estate speculation." "Miguel," Helen hesitated, biting her lip. "There's more. I found records of an offshore company buying large amounts of Thompson Tech stock, always a day before each eviction was announced." "The stock price always goes up when we announce expansion," Miguel completed the thought. "My uncle is profiting from both sides, real estate speculation and the stock market." Lucas approached, holding his favorite dinosaur. "Uncle Miguel, are you sad?" Helen's heart melted as she saw Miguel smile genuinely for the first time in days, crouching down to the boy's level. "No, champ, just thinking a lot." "When I think a lot, Mommy makes hot chocolate," Lucas declared with the wisdom of a 4-year-old. Helen laughed, standing up. "I think we all deserve a break. I'll make hot chocolate for us." In the small kitchen, she tried to organize not only the facts she had uncovered, but also her conflicting feelings. Miguel was nothing like she expected from a billionaire. He was kind, dedicated, and showed genuine concern for the people affected by his uncle's actions. "Need help?" Miguel's voice surprised her. He stood in the kitchen doorway watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Can you grab the mugs up there?" she asked, pointing to the high cabinet. As he stretched to reach the mugs, Helen couldn't help but notice how his dress shirt, now with rolled-up sleeves and a few buttons undone, revealed a more human side of the young executive. "You know," he commented, placing the mugs on the counter. "Lucas reminds me a lot of how I was at his age, curious and full of energy." Helen smiled, stirring the chocolate on the stove. "That and protected," Ethan replied, his voice softening. "My parents, despite all the work, always made sure to keep our family close. Hot chocolate was our Sunday night tradition." Helen felt tears forming in her eyes. "Ethan, I'm sorry for judging you so harshly at first. The sharp ring of Ethan's phone interrupted the moment. It was Emily. "Ethan, you need to turn on the TV right now." The assistant's voice sounded alarmed. Rushing to the living room, they turned on the news. The anchor was reading a statement, with a grave expression. "The board of directors of Thompson Tech announced today that Ethan Thompson, the current CEO of the company, will be temporarily relieved of his duties due to concerns about his mental health." According to an official statement, the young executive has been exhibiting erratic behavior and making decisions that jeopardize the future of the company. "This can't be happening," Ethan murmured, stunned. "There's more," Emily continued over the phone. "Richard is calling a press conference for tomorrow, And Ethan is Beatrice's back. Helen noticed how Ethan paled upon hearing that name. Who's Beatrice? My ex-fiancée, he replied, his voice trembling slightly. And the person who knows. All my darkest secrets. Lucas, sensing the tension in the air, hugged Ethan's leg. Don't be sad, Uncle Ethan. Do you want to borrow my dinosaur? The innocent gesture of the child brought tears to Ethan's eyes. Helen, moved by an impulse, held his hand. You're not alone in this fight, she whispered. The three of us won't let your uncle win. Ethan intertwined his fingers with hers, finding strength in that simple touch. The hot chocolate forgotten on the stove began to overflow, but in that moment, nothing else mattered except the certainty that they had found something far more valuable than any fortune. An improvised family, united against the adversities yet to come. The press conference was scheduled for 10 in the morning in the main auditorium of Thompson Tech. Helen watched from her living room TV, her heart heavy, as Ethan faced a crowd of reporters alongside his uncle. Emily had insisted that he attend, to avoid looking guilty. The accusations about my nephew's mental instability are unfortunately true, Richard declared with feigned regret. As a family, we tried to handle this internally, but his recent actions have forced us to take drastic measures. The camera focused on Ethan, who maintained a controlled expression, though Helen could see the tension in his jaw. It was then that an elegant figure approached the microphone, Beatrice Montgomery, stunning in an impeccable red suit. As Ethan's ex-fiancée and a current member of the advisory board, she began, her melodious voice laden with studied concern. I can confirm that his behavior has become increasingly erratic since the tragedy with his parents. Lucas, who was playing with his building blocks, looked up at the TV. Mommy, why is that lady saying bad things about Uncle Ethan? Helen hugged her son, unable to explain the complexities of the situation. Her phone buzzed with a message from Emily. Meet in 20 minutes, Aroma Cafe, urgent. Let's go for a walk, sweetheart. Helen suggested to her son, turning off the TV. She couldn't bear to see Ethan being publicly attacked any longer. At the cafe, Emily was already waiting for them at a discreet table in the back. Her usually composed face showed concern. Beatrice didn't come back by chance, she said, as soon as Helen sat down while Lucas distracted himself with a piece of cake. I found this in the old files. Emily slid an envelope across the table. Inside were old photos of Beatrice with Richard in compromising situations dated 2 years ago, back when she was still engaged to Ethan. She was involved with Richard even before. Helen felt her stomach churn. Exactly, Emily confirmed. But there's more. Beatrice isn't just a betrayed ex-fiancée who came back for revenge. She's the niece of the largest minority shareholder of the company. If Ethan is permanently removed, her family gains enough power to support any decision Richard makes. That's why he brought her back, Helen concluded. She knows all of Ethan's weak points, including the real reason the engagement ended. A familiar voice interrupted the conversation. Ethan was standing by the table, looking exhausted. Ethan! Helen instinctively stood up, noticing his deep, dark circles. Shouldn't you be at the press conference? I left as soon as I could. He sat down, accepting the cup of coffee Emily quickly ordered. I couldn't stand that charade anymore. Uncle, Ethan. Lucas jumped onto his lap, offering a piece of his cake. The innocent gesture drew a tired smile from the executive. What did you mean about the real reason for the breakup? Helen asked softly. Ethan sighed, distractedly hugging Lucas. Beatrice didn't just betray me with my uncle. She went through my office, copied documents, leaked information to competitors. When I found out, she threatened to expose some personal issues from my teenage years if I reported her. What kind of issues? Helen asked, concerned. A rebellious phase after I started college at 16, he explained, embarrassed. Parties, some not-so-great substances. Nothing serious, but enough to tarnish my image if exposed the wrong way, especially now with these accusations about my mental health. But that was years ago, Helen protested. You were practically a kid. In the corporate world, Helen, it doesn't matter when it happened. The narrative is everything, Emily explained. If Beatrice exposes this now, along with the accusations of mental instability, Ethan loses any chance of regaining control of the company, Helen concluded, feeling a wave of protectiveness for the man in front of her. Lucas, oblivious to the tension in the conversation, played with the napkin, making folds. "Look, Mom, I made a plane." The improvised origami sparked something in Helen's mind. "Ethan, you said Beatrice copied documents from your office. How exactly did she do that?" "Mostly with her phone," he replied, frowning. "Why?" "Because every digital file leaves traces," Helen exclaimed, her technical side emerging. "Metadata, access times, IP addresses. If she used the company's Wi-Fi to send those files, we can track who she sent them to," Emily added, her eyes shining. "The company's server logs are kept for 5 years. Ethan looked at the two women with renewed hope. "Emily, can you get access to those logs?" "Yes, but I'll need help," she hesitated. "The security system was recently updated." "I can help," Helen offered. "I know digital registration systems. Well, it was part of my job at the agencies." Ethan watched the two women begin to plan, feeling for the first time in days that there might be a light at the end of the tunnel. Lucas, still on his lap, offered another piece of cake. "Uncle Ethan, when I'm sad, Mom always says everything will be okay," the boy declared with childlike wisdom. Ethan hugged the child, exchanging a meaningful look with Helen. "Your mom is a very wise woman, champ." The moment was interrupted by Emily's phone. Her expression changed as she read the message. "Ethan, Richard just called an extraordinary board meeting for tomorrow. They're going to vote on your permanent removal." The group exchanged glances, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on them. They had less than 24 hours to find evidence against Beatrice and Richard, or Ethan would lose everything his parents had built. Night fell over New York, but the lights in Helen's apartment remained on. Lucas was asleep in the bedroom, while in the living room, now converted into an improvised headquarters, Helen and Ethan worked frantically on their laptops. Emily had returned to the company to access the internal servers, maintaining constant communication via encrypted messages. "More coffee," Helen offered, noticing Ethan's tired eyes. "Please," he smiled weakly. "I think I found something interesting here. The logs show frequent access to the main server from a specific IP, always after business hours." Helen leaned in, peering over his shoulder at the screen. "Let me see. This access pattern is typical of someone trying to avoid detection. And, look, all the accesses were made from the same device." "Beatrice's phone," Ethan confirmed. "She always stayed late at the office, said she was preparing reports." "Preparing reports, sure," Helen scoffed, feeling a pang of jealousy that surprised her. "Ethan, I need to ask you something. Why did you never report her, the real reason?" Ethan hesitated, spinning the coffee cup between his hands. "Besides the threats about my past, I felt guilty. I thought I had failed to see who she really was, that I had disappointed my parents by being so naive." Helen sat beside him on the couch. "You were young, Ethan, and you were dealing with a devastating loss." "How do you do it?" he asked suddenly. "Being so strong, raising Lucas on your own, facing all these hardships." "I don't have a choice," she shrugged but smiled. "When you have someone who depends entirely on you, you find strength you didn't even know existed." A sound from the room interrupted the conversation. Lucas was calling for his mother, likely having one of his frequent nightmares. Helen quickly stood up. "I'll check on him." Ethan watched her walk to the room, feeling a wave of admiration and something more, something he didn't dare name yet. His phone vibrated. A message from Emily. "I got access to the backup of the old emails. There's something you need to see now. I'm on my way." 15 minutes later, Emily arrived breathless, carrying a flash drive. "You won't believe what I found. There are emails between Beatrice and Richard from 2 years ago, weeks before the accident with your parents, Ethan," Helen returned, from the room just in time to see Ethan pale as he read the emails projected on the laptop screen. "No," he murmured, his voice choked. They knew about my parents' trip. They knew that the car—" "Ethan?" Helen held his hand tightly. "Breathe, let's read this calmly." The emails revealed a web of conspiracies much deeper than they had imagined. Richard and Beatrice hadn't just shared confidential information, they had orchestrated a complex plan to take control of the company. The accident that claimed Ethan's parents hadn't been a coincidence. Your father uncovered irregularities, Emily explained, pointing to one of the emails. He was about to expose an embezzlement scheme led by Richard. Their trip, it wasn't just business. Helen watched Ethan with concern. Her hand still held his, offering silent support as he processed the revelations. "We need more," he finally said, his voice filled with determination. "These emails are important, but Richard could claim they're forged. We need something concrete, something current." "Maybe I have an idea," Helen said, her eyes gleaming with inspiration. "Emily, you said Beatrice still uses the same phone, right? And that she always accesses the company server with it." "Yes, why?" "Because every device that connects to the corporate network needs to have the company's security certificate installed," Helen explained, her technical side emerging. "And that certificate allows remote access in case of security emergencies." Ethan looked at her with admiration. "You're suggesting hack her phone?" "Yes," Helen finished, blushing slightly. "It's not exactly legal, but considering what they did, it might work," Emily agreed, excited. "But we need to act fast. The board meeting is in—" She checked her watch. "Less than 8 hours." "Then let's do it," Ethan decided, his voice firm. "But first, I need you two to understand the risks. If something goes wrong—" "Ethan," Helen interrupted him, her eyes meeting his with intensity. "We're already in this together, all the way." A cry from the room broke the tension of the moment. "Mommy!" "I'll go with you," Ethan offered, surprising Helen. Together, they went to the room where Lucas was sitting on the bed, hugging his stuffed dinosaur. "I had a bad dream," the boy sniffled. "It's okay, champ." Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, while Helen hugged their son. "You know, when I had nightmares, my mum always said that bad dreams are just our minds preparing us to be stronger." Helen watched the interaction with a heavy heart. In just a few days, Ethan had become such a natural presence in their lives that it was hard to imagine what it was like before him. "I'll make more coffee," Emily announced from the doorway, smiling discreetly at the family scene. "We have a long night ahead." The early hours advanced, and with them grew the hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally come to light. But time was running against them, and the darkest secrets were yet to be revealed. The sun was beginning to rise when Beatrice's phone finally succumbed to the meticulously planned digital attack by Helen. Messages and files began to materialize on the laptop screen, revealing a web of conspiracy even more complex than they had imagined. "My God," Emily whispered, scrolling through the conversations. "They didn't just plan the accident, they've been preparing this for years." Ethan, who had been pacing nervously around the room, stopped abruptly. "How so?" "Look at this," Helen pointed to the screen. "These are land purchase contracts under the names of shell companies, all signed by Richard, dated 3 years ago. And all these lands are exactly where the evictions are happening now," Ethan finished, his voice trembling with contained anger. He already knew about the subway expansion plans. He had it all planned out. "Ethan," Helen called softly, noticing his growing agitation. "There's more. I found conversations between Beatrice and a private investigator. They've been watching you, and me and Lucas too." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What?" "Since the day you helped us with the eviction," Helen continued, her voice slightly shaking. "They have photos of us, reports of every move. Lucas chose that moment to come out of the room, dragging his favorite blanket. "Mommy, I'm hungry." Helen quickly minimized the images on the screen, forcing a smile. "I'll make your breakfast, sweetheart." "I'll do it," Emily offered, sensing that Helen and Ethan needed to talk. "Come on, Lucas, I'll teach you how to make special pancakes." As soon as they were alone, Ethan collapsed onto the couch, covering his face with his hands. "I'm sorry, Helen. I put you and Lucas in danger." "No." She knelt in front of him, holding his hands. "You saved us, and now we're saving you." Miguel looked up, meeting her gaze. In the quiet of the morning, with the distant sound of laughter coming from the kitchen where Lucas and Emily were preparing coffee, something shifted between them. The unspoken words hung heavily in the air. "Helena, The shrill ring of Emily's phone interrupted the moment. "Miguel," she shouted from the kitchen, "it's Dr. Mendez, your lawyer. He needs to speak with you urgently." The lawyer's call brought alarming news. Richard had moved the board meeting to 9 o'clock, in less than 2 hours. He must have found out that Emily accessed the servers, Helena concluded. They're trying to corner us. We don't have time to organize all this evidence, Emily said, worried. There are thousands of files, emails, contracts. We don't need everything, Miguel declared, an idea forming. We just need enough to make Richard and Beatrice turn on each other. How so? Helena asked, intrigued by the glint in his eyes. Beatrice has always been vain, proud of her intelligence, Miguel explained. And my uncle, he has an even bigger weakness, his ego. If we provoke them the right way in front of the board, they'll want to boast about how clever they were, Helena finished, understanding the plan. But Miguel, it's risky if it goes wrong. It won't, he said, holding her hands firmly, because I have you by my side. Emily, who was frantically organizing the most important files, looked up. Ethan, there's something here you need to see before we go. It's about the day of your parents' accident. Helen felt Ethan tense beside her. In the file opened by Emily, there was an exchange of messages between Richard and Beatrice, dated the morning of the accident. It's done, Richard's message said. Albert and Marina will never make it to that meeting with the investors. The issue with the car's brakes was implemented as planned. In a few hours, the company will be ours. Beatrice's response was even more disturbing. Great. Ethan is devastated, vulnerable. It will be easy to manipulate him now. Soon, we'll have total control. The silence that followed was deafening. Helen could feel Ethan trembling. Years of pain and repressed anger finally finding their explanation. Uncle Ethan? Lucas's small voice broke the tension. He was standing at the kitchen door, holding a plate with misshapen pancakes. I made these so you wouldn't be sad. Ethan knelt down, taking the plate from the small hands with a touched smile. Thank you, champ. You know what? You and your mum have taught me more about family in these few days than I've learned in years. Helen discreetly wiped away a tear. Emily, can you stay with Lucas? I need to go with Ethan to the meeting. But Helen! Ethan began to protest. No more, she interrupted firmly. You helped me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn. The clock read 8:15 when they left the apartment. In the back seat of the car, a folder contained the carefully selected evidence. Not all of it, just enough for their strategy to work. The rest was safe with Emily, who would alert the authorities at the right moment. Everything will be fine, Helen whispered, intertwining her fingers with Ethan's as he drove. He nodded, squeezing her hand in return. The morning sun illuminated New York, and with it came the hope that the truth would finally come to light. The final battle was about to begin. The meeting room at Thompson Tech was packed when Ethan and Helen arrived. Board members, executives, and key shareholders filled their seats around the imposing marble table. Richard, elegant in his Italian suit, was speaking quietly with Beatrice, who wore a confident smile. Are you sure you want to do this? Ethan whispered to Helen, pausing before they entered. Their hands were still intertwined, drawing strength from each other. Absolutely, she replied, adjusting the folder of documents on her free arm. Let's end this. The entrance of the two caused an immediate stir. Richard raised his eyebrows upon seeing Helen, his fake smile faltering for a moment. Ethan, what a pleasant surprise, he said, his voice dripping with irony. Though I must remind you that this is a private board meeting. Your friend is not authorized to be here. Helen stays, Ethan declared firmly, pulling out a chair for her. In fact, she has some very interesting information to share with everyone. Beatrice laughed, an artificial sound that echoed through the room. Darling, you're only proving our point about your instability, bringing a stranger to a meeting of this level. Unknown, Helen interrupted, her voice calm but sharp. Interesting that you say that, Beatrice, considering you have photos of me and my son taken by your private investigator. Beatrice's smile froze. Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Gentlemen of the board, I think we can begin. Our agenda today, Ethan interrupted him, his voice thundering through the room, is to expose the truth about what really happened to my parents. A heavy silence fell over the room. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan, Richard warned, I don't think you want to do this. Oh, but I do, Ethan smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. For example, I'm sure everyone Here would be interested to know about the shell companies you created 3 years ago, long before the evictions began. That's absurd, Richard declared, but Helen noticed a drop of sweat trickling down his temple. Really? Helen opened her folder, distributing copies of some documents. Then how do you explain these land purchase contracts, all signed by you, in areas that coincidentally would be affected by the subway expansion? Insider information, one of the board members murmured, examining the papers. Ethan is clearly disturbed, Beatrice tried to intervene, making up conspiracies. Like I made up that you accessed the company servers late at night. Ethan cut her off. Or that you and my uncle had been planning all this for years. You have no proof, Richard growled, his veneer of civility beginning to crack. Actually, Helen smiled, sliding another document across the table, we have records of all your conversations, including the ones from the morning of the accident. The colour drained from Richard and Beatrice's faces simultaneously. The murmurs in the room grew louder. You were always so proud of your intelligence, Beatrice, Ethan continued, his voice dripping with disdain. Always bragging about how you could manipulate everyone around you. It must have been very satisfying to make a fool of me all those years. You don't understand, Beatrice exploded, her eyes flashing. You were too young, too naive to lead this company. Richard had vision, he had plans. Plans that included sabotage and murder, Helen asked softly. They were going to ruin everything, Richard shouted, slamming the table. Years of planning, millions in secret investments. Albert was going to expose everything in that meeting with the foreign investors. We couldn't allow it. A collective gasp swept through the room. Richard, realizing too late what he had confessed, turned pale. Gentlemen, a deep voice sounded from the door. Dr. Mendez, Ethan's lawyer, entered accompanied by 2 officers. I think we've heard enough. The chaos that followed was controlled but intense. As Richard and Beatrice were led out of the room, the board members argued heatedly about the next steps. Ethan remained seated, watching everything with an inscrutable expression. It's over, Helen whispered, squeezing his hand. Not yet, he replied, standing up. Gentlemen, his strong voice silenced the discussions. As president and majority shareholder of Thompson Tech, I have an announcement to make. All eyes turned to him. Helen felt her heart race, anticipating what was coming next. Starting today, Thompson Tech will return to its roots. All evictions will be reversed. Contracts with small suppliers will be reinstated, and more. We will establish a foundation, in my parents' name, focused on supporting small entrepreneurs and families affected by real estate speculation. The next few hours were a whirlwind of decisions, signatures, and reorganization. When they finally left the building, it was already night. In the car, on the way to Helen's apartment, where Lucas was waiting for them with Emily, Ethan finally allowed the tears to come. They would be proud of you, Helen said softly, gently wiping his face. Ethan held her hand, kissing it tenderly. I couldn't have done it without you. You and Lucas. You gave me back something I thought I had lost forever. What? She asked, though her heart already knew the answer. A family, he replied simply, and in that word was contained all the love that was beginning to blossom between them. 6 months had passed since the revelation at the Thompson Tech Board meeting. The company's headquarters still stood imposingly against the New York skyline, but something had fundamentally changed in its essence. The glass walls now reflected not only the morning sun, but also a new philosophy of work and humanity. On the top floor, the president's office was different. The heavy old curtains had been replaced with light blinds, allowing natural light to flood the space. On the desk that once displayed only financial reports, there were now also colorful drawings made by Lucas. Mr. Thompson? Emily peeked her head through the door. The inauguration of the Albert and Marina Thompson Foundation starts in an hour. Ethan smiled, adjusting his tie, a gesture that now brought more comfort than anxiety. Thank you, Emily. Has Helen arrived yet? She's in the lobby with Lucas. And before you ask, yes, he's wearing the bow tie you gave him, even though he's complaining that it itches his neck. Ethan laughed, picking up his briefcase. The panoramic elevator descended smoothly, revealing the activity on the ground floor. The lobby, once cold and impersonal, had been renovated to include a communal space where small business owners could gather and network. Helena looked stunning in a navy blue dress, her hair loose framing her radiant face. Lucas, dashing in his miniature suit, ran as soon as he saw Ethan. "Uncle Ethan!" He jumped into his arms. "Look, I'm wearing the tie even though it itches." "Oh, you look very handsome, champ," Ethan laughed, ruffling his hair. He approached Helena, kissing her gently. "You look breathtaking." "And you're late," she teased, adjusting his tie with a tender gesture. "The guests are already arriving at the convention center." The chosen location for the foundations. Inauguration was symbolic. An old industrial warehouse that was originally slated for demolition in Richard's plans, now transformed into a modern hub for entrepreneurial support. When they arrived, the auditorium was already packed, always bragging about how you could manipulate everyone around you. "It must have been very satisfying to make a fool of me all those years." "You don't understand," Beatrice exploded, her eyes flashing. "You were too young, too naive to lead this company. Richard had vision. He had plans." "Plans that included sabotage and murder?" Helen asked softly. "They were going to ruin everything," Richard shouted, slamming the table. "Years of planning, millions in secret investments. Albert was going to expose everything in that meeting with the foreign investors. We couldn't allow it." A collective gasp swept through the room. Richard, realizing too late what he had confessed, turned pale. "Gentlemen," a deep voice sounded from the door. Dr. Mendez, Ethan's lawyer, entered accompanied by 2 officers. "I think we've heard enough." The chaos that followed was controlled but intense. As Richard and Beatrice were led out of the room, the board members argued heatedly about the next steps. Ethan remained seated, watching everything with an inscrutable expression. "It's over," Helen whispered, squeezing his hand. "Not yet," he replied, standing up. "Gentlemen," his strong voice silenced the discussions, "as president and majority shareholder of Thompson Tech, I have an announcement to make." All eyes turned to him. Helen felt her heart race, anticipating what was coming next. Starting today, Thompson Tech will return to its roots. All evictions will be reversed, contracts with small suppliers will be reinstated, and more. We will establish a foundation, in my parents' name, focused on supporting small entrepreneurs and families affected by real estate speculation. The next few hours were a whirlwind of decisions, signatures, and reorganization. When they finally left the building, it was already night. In the car on the way to Helen's apartment where Lucas was waiting for them with Emily, Ethan finally allowed the tears to come. "They would be proud of you," Helen said softly, gently wiping his face. Ethan held her hand, kissing it tenderly. "I couldn't have done it without you. You and Lucas. You gave me back something I thought I had lost forever." "What?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "Her family," he replied simply, and in that word was contained all the love that was beginning to blossom between them. 6 months had passed since the revelation at the Thompson Tech board meeting. The company's headquarters still stood imposingly against the New York skyline, but something had fundamentally changed in its essence. The glass walls now reflected not only the morning sun, but also a new philosophy of work and humanity. On the top floor, the president's office was different. The heavy old curtains had been replaced with light blinds, allowing natural light to flood the space. On the desk that once displayed only financial reports, there were now also colorful drawings made by Lucas. "Mr. Thompson?" Emily peeked her head through the door. "The inauguration of the Albert and Marina Thompson Foundation starts in an hour." Ethan smiled, adjusting his tie, a gesture that now brought more comfort than anxiety. "Thank you, Emily. Has Helen arrived yet?" "She's in the lobby with Lucas. And before you ask, yes, he's wearing the bow tie you gave him, even though he's complaining that it familiar and new faces mingled in the audience. Former suppliers rehired, families benefiting from the housing regularization program, young entrepreneurs eager for mentorship opportunities." "Nervous?" Helena whispered as they prepared to take the stage. "A little," Ethan admitted. "But for the first time in a long while, it's a good kind of nervousness." The buzz of the audience quieted as Ethan took his place at the microphone. Helena and Lucas sat in the front row, their smiles giving him courage. "6 months ago," he began, his voice steady, "I thought I had lost Evitch's neck." Ethan laughed, picking up his briefcase. The panoramic elevator descended smoothly, revealing the activity on the ground floor. The lobby, once cold and impersonal, had been renovated to include a communal space where small business owners could gather and network. Helena looked stunning in a navy blue dress, her hair loose, framing her radiant face. Lucas, dashing in his miniature suit, ran as soon as he saw Ethan. "Uncle Ethan," he jumped into his arms. "Look, I'm wearing the tie even though it itches." "You look very handsome, champ," Ethan laughed, ruffling his hair. He approached Helena, kissing her gently. "You look breathtaking." "And you're late," she teased, adjusting his tie with a tender gesture. "The guests are already arriving at the convention center." The chosen location for the foundation's inauguration was symbolic, an old industrial warehouse that was originally slated for demolition in Richard's plans, now transformed into a modern hub for entrepreneurial support. When they arrived, the auditorium was already packed.